Hello and welcome. In this episode, I'm going to share 4 Sasquatch stories with behavior by the creatures that are closely associated with the beings. This includes tree knocks, whooping, approaching tents, touching them, and even looking inside. They seem to be fascinated by humans, and the way they come into camps to have a look around and go through things only adds credence to this belief. Alright, let's get to the first story. The first story of this episode takes place in the Uinta Mountains in Utah. Located in the northeastern part of the state, the Uinta Mountains are a part of the Ashley National Forest, which was established by President Theodore Roosevelt in 1908. The Uinta mountain range was established by Congress in 1984 and covers 460,000 acres. It is the largest wilderness area in Utah and is a popular destination for fishing, hiking, backpacking, horsepacking, hunting, and other outdoor activities. The original poster, or OP, had embarked on a late August, week-long backpacking trip through the high Uintas. That would end near Granddaddy Lake, where he would spend the last 2 nights of his trip. Granddaddy Lake is located in Granddaddy Basin in the high Uintas wilderness area. It is an extremely popular area for backpacking, camping, and fishing, making it likely you will encounter other people in this area. This is an important detail for the story. On his way to the basin, the OP came across 2 men who were leaving the area. They told him they'd been in the Granddaddy Basin for 4 days and hadn't seen anyone throughout the duration of their stay. They also mentioned that it had been very quiet there. When he got to the basin, the OP immediately noticed that it was indeed extremely quiet. He didn't see or hear hardly any wildlife at all. He specifically mentions that this includes birds as well. The first night passed without incident, and the next day was also uneventful. He hiked around the perimeter of the lake but did not see anyone else. In fact, other than the 2 guys he saw while hiking into the basin, he would see no one else in this popular area. The following day would bring a storm into the area that caused the temperatures to drop to the point that when the snow began to fall, it stuck to the ground. The OP was at an elevation of approximately 10,000 feet or 3,000 meters, so he settled into his tent just after the sun disappeared behind the mountain peaks. He would sleep until about 2:30 a.m. when he was awakened by a loud knock. From what he could tell, the knock came from the north of his camp. It was then followed by a loud whoop coming from the same direction. He laid quiet in his sleeping bag, listening when a second whoop sounded farther away than the first, but also to the north. Whatever made the first whooping sound replied to the second. The whooping continued for about 15 minutes, slowly moving to the north, away from his camp. The sounds eventually stopped and the area fell silent once again. He did not sleep well after that. The next morning he had to set out early to make it to his car, so he didn't get the chance to look for any evidence of what might have been making the knocking and whooping sounds. He doesn't go so far as to say that he thought it was a Sasquatch, but he does say he's never heard anything quite like those whooping sounds, even having spent most of his life hiking and backpacking. Even if the OP doesn't say for sure if he thought these were Sasquatch, the whooping and knocking are the 2 most common occurrences in Sasquatch-related encounters, whether the cryptids are seen or not. The whooping is usually described as sounding unlike any other animal, or sounding something ape-like in areas where there are no apes. One commenter describes hearing the same knocking and whooping sounds in Gifford-Pinchot National Forest in Washington State, describing the whooping as ape-like and something no human could replicate. If you haven't heard recordings of these whooping sounds, I would definitely recommend looking up the famous recordings known as the Sierra Sounds. The next story takes place in Alcona County, Michigan. Alcona County is in the northeastern part of the Lower Peninsula and borders Lake Huron of the Great Lakes. It covers a total area of 1,791 square miles or 4,640 kilometers and is part of the Osable State Forest, which includes many of the surrounding counties. 62% of Alcona County is covered by water. The original poster was camping with one of his friends in late October when the incident took place. He states that he is unsure what he saw and says he will probably never know for sure, but thinks it might have been a Sasquatch. They chose a campsite that was closed for the season, and upon inspecting their surroundings quickly realized they were the only ones in the area. This wasn't unusual as the weather was getting colder at the time of year and they were in the middle of nowhere. They chose a campsite farther into the woods surrounded by trees because the already falling snow and wind were picking up. After eating the canned food they brought, they went to sleep. During the night, the OP was awakened by loud footsteps in the snow. They sounded human-like and he expected a police officer, being that they were camping in a closed campsite. But whoever it was didn't have a light. He figured that if there was an officer patrolling the area, he would have expected them to have a flashlight. The footsteps approached the tent and the OP was trying to decide if he should wake his friend or not, when whatever it was touched their tent a few times before brushing its hand along the side. Fear seized him and he tensed up in his sleeping bag, trying to stay as quiet as possible. The footsteps receded from the tent, heading toward the direction of the picnic table. The OP knows this because he soon began hearing whatever this was throwing empty cans. He lay there still and quiet, waiting for the noise to stop before waking up his friend and asking if he heard anything. His friend, of course, had heard nothing. The OP began freaking out at this point and ended up vomiting because he was so scared, asking his friend if they could just leave and head home. His friend obliged and they packed up their belongings at around 3 a.m. and left. He didn't think of it at the time due to how afraid he was, but he now wishes he had thought to check the area for footprints before they left. Being under extreme duress, all he could think about was getting out of there. He asks at the end of his post what readers think it might have been that came to their camp. Whatever came to their camp definitely exhibited the same behaviors described in a lot of Sasquatch encounters. When they come into camp like this, it seems to be more of a curiosity thing rather than an aggressive act. It seemed to touch their tent in a curious manner before approaching the picnic table to inspect the food cans. Sasquatch seemed to be fascinated with humans, as seems to be the case here, if this was indeed a Sasquatch. Then again, since the OP could not confirm exactly who or what the visitor was, it very well could have been another person. Either way, I believe they did the right thing by getting out of there. The OP's gut told him it was time to go, so that's exactly what they did. It's important to remember to always trust your gut in these situations. What do you think came into their camp that night? The next story comes from Kentucky. The original poster changes the name of the county for privacy reasons, but does say it is a very rural area and is in a part of the state where the Appalachian Mountains run through. This leads me to believe the encounter takes place in the southeastern part of the state. He describes the county as pretty much all backwoods with winding roads that lead up into the mountain range. This OP is sharing his father's story, which details his encounter with an unknown beast thought to be a Sasquatch, while staying with the OP's grandmother at her trailer deep in the woods. The OP was 9 or 10 years old at the time of the events, but remembers overhearing a phone call his mother received from his father just after the encounter took place. He would later hear several accounts of the story. His grandmother, as mentioned before, lived alone in a trailer deep in the woods. His grandparents originally bought the trailer back in the late 60s or early 70s. His grandfather passed away in 2007, leaving his grandmother living out there alone. He notes that there are 2 peach trees planted in the yard, which he and one commenter believe could have attracted the thought to be Sasquatch. The first few years his grandmother lived there went by without incident, but in 2010 she began hearing knocks and bangs on the outside of her trailer at night. The trailer had metallic siding, so the noise would keep her up all night. Whatever was banging and knocking on the trailer would stop for some time, but eventually start back up again. It got to the point where the OP's father began staying with her at night, but this did nothing to curtail the noises. His father would grab his grandfather's gun and rush out the front door to find no one there. The night of the sighting, his father was again staying at the trailer with the OP's grandmother and great aunt when they heard a loud commotion at the back door. His father picked up a flashlight and went out back to see an enormous black creature walking away from a trash can. He followed the thing down a slope toward the road and says it turned around to look at him twice. He distinctly remembers the glowing red eyes looking back at him. He turned and went back to the trailer when the being disappeared into the woods. He says in response to a comment that his father must have been terrified by the experience because he never talked about it. The rest of the family dismissed his encounter entirely, with his aunt, who was over at their house one night when the story was brought up, saying it must have been a deer bumping the side of the trailer at night. But his father said the bangs and knocks were way too loud to be a deer accidentally bumping into the trailer, and his grandmother and great aunt both corroborated his story. I'm leaning towards Sasquatch here because of the knocking and banging on the trailer at night. However, the black fur could point toward this creature being a dogman. Most Sasquatch are described as having brown fur, but it could have just looked black in the darkness. If it was a Sasquatch, this again seems to be another encounter with a curious or hungry Sasquatch, being that his actions did not seem to be aggressive. Perhaps it was just intrigued by the trailer and or searching for some food from the pear trees or in the garbage. I've heard other stories where they and other cryptids like to rummage through the garbage cans. This is another behavior exhibited by dogmen, which is why I thought that could be a possibility. What do you think his father saw that night? Would you have followed the creature into the woods? The final story of this episode takes place in an area just south of Mount Rainier in Washington state. Mount Rainier is an active volcano approximately 59 miles or 95 kilometers south of Seattle. It is part of the Cascade Range located in Mount Rainier National Park. Its peaks reach an elevation of 14,411 feet or 4,392 meters and is the highest mountain in Washington state and the Cascade Range. It is also a hotspot for cryptid and paranormal activity, as reports of UFOs, Sasquatch, and other cryptids are common in the area. The original poster went on a camping trip with his wife and daughter. They would be meeting their friends at their usual campsite just south of Mount Rainier National Park, a spot right off a service road that had a makeshift fire pit and was not an official campground. There would be 10 of them in total. 7 adults, 3 children in the tween age range, and some dogs. The service road eventually entered the park but was only accessible by park staff. Passage was blocked by a locked gate, so they knew they were the only campsite in that area. Once camp was set up, they made and ate dinner, and the adults hung out by the fire having drinks while the children played. Eventually, the group dwindled as everyone went to sleep, with the OP and his daughter the last 2 to remain awake, sitting by the fire. His wife had gone to the car to warm up but had fallen asleep. His daughter decided she wanted to sleep in the car with her mother instead of her tent. So she went to her tent and grabbed blankets and sleeping bags for her and her mother before zipping up the tent and going to the car to go to bed. The OP stayed up a little longer to tend to the fire but dozed off and woke up to dimly glowing embers in the fire pit. He then retreated to his tent where he would fall asleep almost immediately. At approximately 3:30 in the morning, he was awoken by rustling and what sounded like hushed voices outside his daughter's tent. He thought nothing of it at first, assuming it was his wife and daughter entering the tent, his wife choosing to sleep in their daughter's tent with her so she didn't wake him. He noticed how quiet everything seemed before he heard sticks crack and break. There was also a popping noise he thought might have been the dying fire holding on. But then whatever was outside his daughter's tent walked around to the front of his tent and stopped. It now stood directly in front of his tent. He slowly sat up and could hear this thing breathing, taking in and releasing a loud, heavy breath. It was the heaviest breath he had ever heard. It was followed by a loud huff, which according to him was similar to a horse, cow, or another very large animal. He sat there stricken by fear, trying to rationalize his current situation and figure out what he was hearing. Everything then went quiet. The only sound after this came in the distance from behind his friends' tents, which were a little farther away from his and sounded to him like an owl hooting. Other than that, everything was eerily still. There was no noise at all. He sat in his tent, frozen in fear, afraid to even breathe, until the sun came up and lit the area. Only then did he muster his courage and exit to inspect his surroundings. He noticed that his daughter's tent was unzipped and it was empty. Panic swept through him as he ran to the car to find his wife and daughter still asleep inside. He also noticed that there wasn't a single track in the area. He starts freaking out at this point, trying to wrap his mind around the previous night's events. He sat for about an hour, starting a new fire, desperately trying to come up with a rational explanation for the rustling and muffled voices he heard, whatever stood outside his tent breathing, and why his daughter's tent was unzipped. He watched her zip it the night before when she retrieved her blankets and sleeping bag. He distinctly remembers this. Eventually, everyone stirs and begins making their way over to the fire. He asked them if their dogs had been out during the night and thought maybe that's what was sniffing around his tent. He also asked them if they had been moving around the campsite during the night or if they heard the owl. They all told him no, that they nor their dogs had been out during the night and they hadn't heard an owl. This only further perplexed the OP. He had no explanation for what happened, but says that having that very large unknown creature stand outside his tent with nothing separating them but the thin tent wall was one of the scariest moments of his life. What was more unsettling to him was that they had another night to get through. He decided then that his family would not be sleeping in their tents that night. In fact, he decided right then and there that they would never sleep in tents again. The day proceeded as normal, with them having breakfast, venturing into the nearest town of Ashford, and hiking to Cora Lake, then hanging out at camp. 3 of the group had left, leaving 7 of them on the trip, with 2 spending most of their time in their tent. The remaining 5 were sitting by the fire as it started to get late when they heard an extending whoop in the distance. A while later, as dusk approached, they heard blood-curdling screams and howls coming from the direction of a creek that ran between them and the park boundary. Everyone stopped and listened. They heard the screams and howls about 4 or 5 more times. The OP describes the screams sounding like a woman being murdered. When the screaming and howling died down, they heard tree knocks coming from the same direction. Their first thought was someone was messing with them. There were a lot of people in the vicinity of about a 15-mile radius. The OP called his friend over who had been preparing dinner on a skillet near a propane lantern. Both devices made a lot of noise, so he hadn't heard anything. They stood and listened, but only silence awaited them. They decided to walk away from camp and try knocking on a tree to provoke a response from whatever was out there. What they got in response sent a chill down the OP's spine that struck him at his core and made his hair stand on end. He could only describe the responding calls as sounding like a monkey or gorilla, but it was far too deep and guttural to be either. They didn't say anything about the response to their knock because they didn't want to freak anyone out more so than they already were. No one planned on sleeping in their tents that night. Again, the whooping and knocking in this story is indicative of Sasquatch behavior. Just like in the other stories, the assumed to be Sasquatch seemed to have a curious nature, and the way they were in and around the daughter's tent, having unzipped it, my guess, to have a look inside, seems to point to them being curious. One explanation for why it came over to the OP's tent was they knew that he was awake. When confirming this, they left the camp. As for the screaming, it is always described the same way in these stories, sounding like a woman being murdered. But that kind of scream is usually associated with other types of cryptids, not Sasquatch. What do you think? Were there Sasquatch in and around their camp? Was something else out there too? Mount Rainier is known for some unexplained things and multiple types of cryptid sightings, so it's possible that all of this could be true. And that's going to do it for this episode. I hope you enjoyed these stories. If you'd like to hear more stories like these and other types of cryptids, make sure to subscribe to the channel. If you want to send me your story, I'd love to read it. My email is wolfwhocriedcryptid@gmail.com. I will also put it in the description below. With your permission, I may want to use it in an episode. Even if you'd prefer that I didn't share your story on my channel and just want someone to listen, email me. we can privately talk about your encounter. And please remember to keep it civil in the comments section. No one deserves to be ridiculed whether they believe or not. Thank you for listening. I'll catch you at the next episode.